and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born. We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impacts social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Well, hello, and welcome to yet another episode of Inflection Point Podcast. I'm Anita Russell, and I thank you for joining us. And we have a really amazing, thought-provoking conversation in store for you today. On this show, if you've been watching us for a while, you know that we challenge our audience to listen actively and intentionally for the purpose of learning and understanding. So having said that, now we'll have a quick hello from Mavis and Gail.
Hi, I'm Mavis Bauman. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter, and welcome.
Excellent, excellent. So let's just jump right into our conversation. Ironically, we're talking about conversation today. So the theme actually is engaging in authentic conversation about race and racism requires listening, not rebuttal. And so we're going to start off by just looking at the word conversation, right? And talking about the art of conversation, because I think we can all agree that conversation is not about argument. It's not about debates. It's not about rebuttals. It's not about any of those types of things. So I'm going to read a little bit from an article from The Conversation, this website called The Conversation. And it's an article by a gentleman by the name of John Armstrong. And in the article, it says, conversation is civilized speech. It is more purposeful than chatter, more humane than gossip, more intimate than debate. But at the same time, it is an elusive ideal. And so it goes on to say, when we're engaged in conversations or just verbal exchanges, if you will, we often can flip from one topic to another, while the conversation sort of implies that something more substantial needs to be happening. So just the word conversation indicates that it's not just this flippant kind of thing where we're 1 second we're talking about the weather and the next second we're talking about flowers in the garden or what's on TV, or some conversations a little bit deeper than that. And so the article goes on to say, a conversation is the encounter of two polished minds. So just think about that expression, two polished minds that are tactful enough to listen, confident enough to express their true beliefs, subtle enough to search out the reasons behind the thoughts. So if you've been following us for a while, you know that our four tenets are courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. And those first two, courage and conversation, actually go hand in hand. Because when you're talking about something like racism, it takes a lot, depending on where you're coming from, what sort of geographical location you're coming from, what is your cultural experiences, and things like that. It can be very, very difficult to have conversations about race. And so that's why in putting this program together, I centered on courage as being that first step. But it's not just courage to step into a conversation about a topic that makes you feel uncomfortable. It's about you stepping into a conversation where part of the point of that conversation is that you are examining yourself, right? So we talk a lot about critical self-reflection, and that is gaining a really intimate understanding of the thoughts, the words, and beliefs that lurk within your own mind, within your own heart, your own spirit. And then also beginning to understand, why do I have these beliefs? Why do I think in this certain way? Or even how did I even come to the place of thinking and believing these types of ideas? And so again, if you've been following us for a while, you've heard Gail and Mavis's story. right? And the reason I'm pointing them out is because this is an example of two white women coming from completely different places in terms of their upbringing. One being very heavily involved in protesting and activism at a relatively young age. That would be Gail. And then Mavis kind of grew up in a different type of environment, more of an all-white environment in Nebraska. But yet here we are as three grown women and being able to engage in these conversations, even though our backgrounds are very different. Even though coming into these conversations, our thoughts may have been very different. But I would say that the difference between us, the three of us, and people who are just can't have these conversations because it always ends up being, oh, well, what about this? Or, oh, what about that? Or, you know, Black people are this and Black people are that, or whatever, without the conversation really being about themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the beauty that the three of us, this triad, if you will, brings to the table, is that we are all three of us, comfortable with having those conversations about what lurks within the inside of us, and then examining what is showing up in our words, our actions, and our behaviors. But the key is that we have conversations about that. And I don't mean conversations just on this show. I mean conversations outside of this show, because we all have, the three of us connected represents a genuine friendship, genuine allyship, genuine respect for one another as human beings. And part of that is the fact that we understand the art of conversation, right? And so I'm just going to pick out a couple of other pieces in the article that jumped out at me. A classical conception of conversation takes convergence as its final, even though distant, goal. So just think about that. The three of us come from completely different places. I was raised on activism for the most part, right? And Gail, describing some of her experiences, came into activism because of some things that she experienced and witnessed in her teenage years. And then Mavis came into all of this much later in her life, right? But the point is, we all converged. Mm-hmm. We are like a meeting of the minds, if you will, and we all converged. And the goal for us is doing this show, talking about racial literacy, talking about historical literacy, understanding those differences that lie within us, because the argument isn't based on like, oh, everybody's just the same. Yeah, we are the same in the sense that we're all human beings and all of that, but we're all very different. But there's nothing wrong with us all being very different. And we can all be very different and still have convergent conversations, because you find that place of mutual agreement oftentimes once you begin to pull back some of those layers within yourself. So it's not about me pulling back Gail's layers or Mavis's layers. It's about us individually understanding who we are and how did we arrive in the place where we are right now as members of a racialized society. That is the beauty of what we have in this experience here. So there's still like another 5 minutes or so. Gail, Mavis, did you want to comment on this segment before we move on?
Well, I think the biggest thing that I thoroughly enjoy and respect from all of us is our genuineness and our honesty, right? We just kind of show up and we're just being who we are. And there's no judgment. It's just this ability to be able to risk that vulnerability and share who we are and see the other. I think that's so crucial. And that's what's missing. We have to let our own ego states get out of the way, right? We have to, ego states are very insecure states of being, and the goal is to let go of them, but we have to have a healthy one first. We have to kind of know who we are and just feel grounded in that and feel comfortable with that. And I think we do, even though we come from very different backgrounds, as you said.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I just want to add too that you framed it up so beautifully. It kind of got me.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is an accomplishment to get several people to converge like that, right? And it's not as if we haven't disagreed, mostly me. I've disagreed because I had no frame of reference to understand some things. But, both Anita and Gail have consistently, lovingly said, here's how this works. And they've worked with me. And I've shared with them, my experience, which was very white and very naive too, because being in the middle of the country at that time was very different than it is now. So, yeah. Okay. I see the warning there.
It's that willingness to risk that vulnerability. I mean, you can't have intimacy at any level without risking vulnerability and without honesty and truth, right? And respect. They all have to be together. And I think we bring that together. That is existing within each of us. And we come to the table with all of it.
Good point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I wanted to read this other quote. So again, if you've been listening to us for a while, you know that a lot of the work that I do as a personal transformation expert, the anti-racism activation work and all of that stuff that I do to a great extent is based on the Harvard University professor, Robert Livingston. Like I quote him all the time. He's like my hero in all of this. And so this is something that he said, and this is a person who has had a career as a sociologist and doing all kinds of research and, how do people talk to one another? How do they not talk to one another? And all that sort of thing. And so I actually rely on his work a lot in the work that I do, because it centers me and it centers me, but it also validates my own thoughts. And when I get this idea, sometimes I'll look and say, oh, I wonder what Dr. Livingston says about this. And so he's just become like a really good resource for me. So this is what he says. Very early on in my career, I thought you could change people's minds, if not hearts, by just providing them with accurate information. With greater wisdom that I have garnered over the 20 years I've been doing this work, I have found that listen to this, how important this is, that social relationships provide a portal for facts to be received and digested by people. Just let that sink in, the visual imagery of that. And without that, people often build walls to insulate what they currently believe to be true. And I think relationships provide an opening within that wall to maybe a different perspective to enter. Isn't that exactly what we're doing here?
Exactly.
Yes.
That's exactly what we are doing here with and again, courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. For me, the four of those things go together. And when I was putting all of this, the concept of inflection point together, those were the four things that I came up with. And then I stumbled upon Dr. Livingston's book. And that's what I mean when I say his work validates the work that I do. And so that was very gratifying for me to know that I was on the right track. Okay, so this is the last thing that I'm going to say, and then I'm going to pass the baton over to Gail. This is, wait, where am I? Okay, so this is why true conversation is not quite like a debate. In a debate, one feels that the argument has priority. But that's not the priority in conversation. In conversation, it is the person that comes first. So when you think about all of those times when I've talked about, harmonizing historical truth with lived experiences, when you're engaging in these types of conversations, the validity of that person's lived experience plays a very big role in that conversation, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Excellent. So,
and the relationship element too.
Yeah.
I was thinking about if we were giving each other things to read, like white people tend to want to read a book and then they know all about racism. If we were just doing that, it would not have the same energy and level of connection. So the relationships are key, really key.
Right.
Absolutely. So at this point, I'm going to pass the baton over to Gail.
All right. Thank you, Anita. Yeah, we all are wired for connection. I think that's the basis of why that can happen. We can be more open to something different or a new perspective when there's a connection, right? When we can feel that base of that connection, as you were saying. One of the most precious aspects of conversation is that it doesn't presuppose agreement, right? It presupposes civility and sincerity. And I love that quote. If you think about that, it really is. That's really what we all are needing in our conversations, is to come from that place, come from more the place of the heart and courage. The word courage comes from the Latin word cor, which means heart, right? And so what's missing in so much of these conversations that turn into fights or arguments or whatever is the heart's missing. We've forgotten and lost that perspective of what are we doing here? Why are we trying to have this conversation? Right. And so we have to kind of begin to look at what are the fears that are getting in the way. And the fears always there. Fear is polar opposite to love. And so it's going to tell us distortions and lies and whatever else that goes along with that. It's going to identify the excuses that we make that in a negative or positive or good or bad. It's going to tell us all kinds of different things that are going to limit our beliefs. And when we limit our beliefs, we feel fear, right? And whatever fear, rejection, or whatever insecurity is there, it's going to become more intense and increase, right? So we have to get rid of that fear. We have to be really honest with ourselves and say, what scares me about having a conversation about this topic or with this person? And just really look within yourself and say, what am I afraid of? Am I afraid that I'm going to be right or wrong? Am I afraid that I'm going to feel like I don't know anything? Am I afraid of whatever the insecurity might be coming up with? And so it's really important to deal with those ego states, right, that are always based in some form of insecurity, because you can't really truly authentically express yourself and your feelings when you're attaching to any level of fear. So you have to get clear within yourself first, I think. And that's working all on its own. I've been doing that work forever. So once you kind of get those ego states a little bit calmed and a little bit more in perspective, you want to think about Douglas Stone stated a quote that I'll say his quote, that the single most important thing you can do is to shift your internal stance from I understand to help me understand. And everything else follows from that. And that's such a huge, it's a little shift, but it's a huge shift, right? Because if I go into a conversation already believing I understand, I'm not going to listen to anything the other person's saying. I'm going to be listening to that dialogue that's going off in my own head. And I'm creating the rebuttal, I'm creating the reaction to it, but I'm not really taking the time to just listen and really hear what the other person is feeling, what they're saying, what their belief system is, right? And so it's crucial to be able to do that, to really get into that headspace. And you have to also be open to experiencing some discomfort. When I talked about risking vulnerability to create any level of intimacy, there's going to be discomfort sometimes. That's almost inevitable, but that's okay. If we can trust and ground ourselves in what we know to be true within ourselves, we can step into that discomfort. And in time, that discomfort will become more familiar and a little bit more comfortable. The more that we are willing to step into that place, that releases all that fear, right? You also have to be very realistic about your expectations. Don't expect that the other person is going to be automatically on your side, quote, and agree with you, because that may not happen. Maybe some things may shift, or maybe it's going to be you that's going to shift. So you want to be open to what the possibilities could be without judging them, without expecting them to be a certain way. You have to set the emotional tone for the conversation. You have to allow yourself to be in a calm state. One of the things I recommend is doing that breathing, that 4-7-8 breathing, where you inhale slowly to a count of 4. You hold the inhale to a count of 7. Then you exhale slowly to a count of 8. When you exhale at a longer rate than what you do inhaling, you activate that vagus nerve, and that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which then gets us all calmed down, and we stay connected to our prefrontal cortex, where all that executive functioning is. You can't have a discussion with somebody if you're disconnected from up here. If you activate another part of your brain, that limbic system and the amygdala that goes into that fight, flight, or freeze, the conversation's over, right? Because your whole nervous system cannot tolerate that, right? So because you're going into activation, or you're going into shutdown, or something, but you're not staying present. And the goal is to make sure you're calm in order to be able to be present in those conversations. Some of the different things an article listed 7 different key mistakes that we can make in order to sort a possible courageous conversation. That we talk too much, or we are not clear about our own message. We're not really thinking, as I said before, about the other person's feelings. We're thinking more about our own thoughts and feelings. You don't want to try to oversimplify something just because it makes it easier to deal with. You want to be willing to step into that hard place that is uncomfortable. You don't want to rehearse or memorize what you're going to say, because then that takes away from any authenticity. And so it's really important to be able to be grounded and really approach a conversation from that place. I want to talk about what some of the skills are, because it's not that difficult. The difficult is everything we've been talking about up until that point, of getting ready to be able to have that conversation, of being really able to tap into your own truth within yourself, and be willing to come to that conversation from a place of genuineness and authenticity and just honesty, and most of all, a willingness to hear and to listen, right? So what this kind of conversation emphasizes is compassion, and instead of using any fear, guilt, shame, blame, coercion, or threat, or justification for any kind of punishment that might come from it. It's really about creating a quality of connection that we all need, and we all need to meet it with compassion and respectful listening, and the ability to express our thoughts and feelings and beliefs in a safe place, because we're wired to want to, and we desire to be safe. And so you want to have this conversation be created from a place that is safe within each person, and that creates that energy between the two, right? So this allows the openness of the heart for empathy, and honesty is like the road that we can travel on then, when we can open our heart, and able to connect from that place within us. And it doesn't mean that I know exactly what you've experienced. I don't know. But it's being willing to say, I don't know what you've experienced, but I want to understand from your perspective what your experience was really like, and then be willing to listen and hear that. That's crucial in being able to have these conversations, right? So there are 2 roles. I've been teaching this communication model for probably 4 or 5 decades. I mean, literally since I started in my own practice. And there's a speaker role and there is a listener role. And that's very important to simplify that, because you can't have a dialogue with both people being the speaker or both people just listening, right? One has to be in one role and one has to be in another role. And if they start to enmesh too much, then there's no dialogue. It becomes a confused monologue from both people, right? But the rules for being the speaker are really important. They must pause every so often in order to give the listener time to reflect on what they are hearing. Because if you don't, you're going to overload the listener. As too much information, 2 or 3 sentences is a lot. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're really listening and you really want to tell the speaker back what you hear, you want to make sure that there's enough time for those pauses in there. And so the speaker has to be kind of mindful of that and allow the listener to be able to take a few moments to say, this is what I hear you're saying. The speaker also has to include in the topic how it affects and causes that speaker to feel. But they must use I statements, so that I feel blank when I experience whatever. I feel this is what I hear when I experience that. This is what I believe when I experience that. So the I, instead of, well, people this or you that, or You want to eliminate all those other pronouns and really just say I. The speaker is also not allowed to use any kind of judgment or blame or criticism. So think about when you're having conversations with a partner, a spouse, or somebody close to you, right? And you're not allowed to ask questions. You're not allowed to use any judgment, any blame, or any criticism, right? That's not easy to do. What that does is it really forces the speaker to own what is really there to own for themselves, right? And so that allows them then to go on and to continue on just owning it without interrupting that flow of conversation. The speaker is allowed to say, I would appreciate it if, towards the end, if there's something that is needed from the listener, they are allowed to say that. And then when the speaker's finished and you're done saying something, you have to make one last statement and let the listener make one last response. And then you switch roles. Then the listener's role, you have to be present. You have to really be relaxed, and you have to be open to your own compassion and empathic heart to be able to actually show empathy to the speaker. There are 3 listening modes, just 3. You maybe find some other ones, but there are 3 big ones. One of the listening skills is mirroring. It's just really saying back what you hear the person saying. What I hear you saying is blank, and I understand from your perspective, you feel or believe blank. And that's key because I understand from your perspective. I'm not putting me in this. I'm really trying to stay focused on really hearing what you are saying to me. The other is called reflective listening. It's when you say, I hear you're feeling blank about something, but it's really it's an attempting to clarify an emotion for the speaker and trying to maybe even deepen that a little bit. So if somebody says, I feel sad, I could come back and say, well, it sounds like you feel really disappointed or disillusioned. It's a little fine tuning. And the speaker may say, no, I don't feel that at all. I really feel this. And it's okay to be wrong in what you're saying, because then that gives the speaker a chance to then clarify a little bit more and go a little bit deeper. And the other skill of listening is called validation. And validation is not when you even agree with or you believe or feel the same way. It's when I can understand how you would feel hurt when. It's the ability to understand from the other person's perspective or experience how they might feel and be willing then to offer that compassion as the listener. And then again, when the speaker's finished, then the speaker makes one last statement and the listener makes one last response. Now, those rules are very similar for both roles, but I want you to think about how often do we use those rules, right? In every conversation we have.
Mm. So, Gail, we have like 1 more minute left in this particular segment. And I want you to say something about this quote. It's from Julia Korn. I believe it was in Positive Psychology. Uh-huh. She's really talking about this idea of empathy. So if in like 20 seconds, you could tell me your response to the quote. For white people in America, it is up to us to listen first. Then we must seek greater knowledge about our country's deeply rooted racism. It is an undue burden on our colleagues and friends of color to teach us about racism and do the mental work for us. So in 30 seconds, what's your response?
Okay, so think about it. If we as a white person, if I'm expecting a Black person to teach me what I need to actually be able to look in that mirror and look within myself and understand, that's like putting more work on top of what has already been put upon, right? Black people as a culture, as a race. That's not fair. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't appreciate that from somebody. And so empathy is, I have to be able to have empathy for the person I'm looking to ask to give that to me. And if they're not willing or able to, that's okay. It doesn't mean I can't find that. I can't understand. I can't go deeper within myself, because that's really where the work has to be. And do that with empathy even for myself.
Yeah, excellent. So we're going to jump to break. And then when we come back, we'll move on to the third segment with Mavis. So we'll be back in like another minute or so.
You've been listening, but are you watching? Tune in to your favorite shows on the Transformation Talk Radio Facebook page. We stream live video podcasts every day, and we love to hear from you. Leave comments and questions for the host to address live, on the air, and get to know the faces behind the voices you love. Just go to Facebook and search for Transformation Talk Radio.
Yeah, yippee skippy to that, baby.
Hi, I'm Patricia McNair, host of Divine Guidance with Patricia, and I'm here to help you live a more authentic, spiritually connected life. Join me every first and third Wednesday at 9 a.m. Pacific on TransformationTalkRadio.com. Being who you are in everyday life is the key to unlocking soul wisdom within that our whole self already knows. Get ready to embrace your spiritual, mental, and emotional well-being, your whole being. Discover your gifts and strengthen your connection to spirit. We will explore earth guidance, divine truth and love, past life lessons, and so much more. So listen in to Divine Guidance with Patricia and join in your personal adventure to triggering, opening, validating, and being all that you are. For more information about me, visit divineguidance.earth.
So welcome back. You are listening to Inflection Point podcast on Transformation Talk Radio. And our topic is engaging in authentic conversation about race and racism requires listening, not rebuttal. So we're going to pass the mic again, and we're going to pass the mic over to Mavis, and she's going to talk about the answer to this question. What do you trust? Statistics, lived experiences, or both? And she's going to talk about it within the context of the myth of Black on Black crime.
Great. Thanks, Anita. I have been, looking at a number of resources on this and thinking about the common phrases that I've heard over my life about crime, about Black people being dangerous, Black on Black crime, and so on. And I just Googled some sentence like that. And lo and behold, this statement came up. Blacks on a conversation site, Blacks commit 60% of all violent crime, but only 14%, but they're only 14% of the population. And you look at that and you think, there it is, black and white. Somebody's taking that, believing it, and perhaps posting it on social media. There's no reference as to where those numbers come from. But this guy goes on to say, why is this? There's no family structure and a community that condones young girls having babies. Other minorities that come to this country without money and without speaking our language still surpass Blacks. It's amazing. So, where is he getting all of these things? These are the kinds of points of view, opinions, racialized beliefs that get fed. And the more they get repeated, the bigger they grow. So just anecdotally, I remember when I was working in my early 20s, I had a great boss who had a great sense of humor. And I remember him telling me about a book called Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. And I never did actually read the whole book. It's written by Michael Wheeler, I believe, in the 70s. And he's talking about how statistics are manipulated for polls, political polls mainly. But the same principle plays out in any the field, any place someone wants to make a point. You can gather the numbers and form statistics to make that point. The fact is that's not necessarily a scientific process. Anita, if I use the wrong words in describing this, let me know.
I will.
But the only way you can really rely on any statistic that you would see, say in social media, the newspaper, whatever, is a trusted resource, and to know that those statistics could be produced by an objective group doing the same sort of research. In other words, even the questions that come into the research are biased very often. the person doing the research has an expectation of a certain outcome, those things are very difficult to rinse out of a research process. But the idea would be then to have something that, like I say, is repeatable and by separate groups. Those kinds of numbers would hold some water. But anyway, this person on this chat page goes on to say, let's stop making excuses and start acting like mature adults. By the way, using some big words doesn't do anything either. We need to take personal responsibility. Let's stop blaming white people, especially since they invented almost everything that makes our lives better. How about that? They know this guy doesn't know about the ice cream scoop, does he?
Or the ironing board or the traffic light.
Right. Oh, yeah, right. All of those things.
Right.
But it seems like he's presenting facts, but he is not presenting facts. He has gathered these things up from his own conversations, probably with other people, and is putting them out there as facts. So I think every one of us can relate to the polls for the 2016 election, how the polls said one thing was going to happen, and that so didn't happen. And it surprised all of us. It's the way those polls are constructed, the bias with the polling organizations, and even the people who answer the questions. They may feel like they're not safe in answering the questions and not answer them truthfully. So where we get our statistics is very, very important. I did find another piece by a conservative organization, the Heritage Foundation, entitled "Who Suffers the Most from Crime Wave?" And this speaks to somewhat the black on black, rhetoric. But the idea is that crime is definitely increasing. But I'll give you the takeaway so I make sure I stay clear on this. The first takeaway is African Americans bear an increasingly large share of the harm from crime. The second one is the relative share of offenders by racial groups followed a similar trend to the share of victims. So it's not like one group, blacks, are committing all the crimes on another group, whites. There is a consistent relationship there. The third one is the spike in crime is hurting a lot of people, and Black communities bear the heaviest burden. So this is all about FBI crime data. And even the Heritage Foundation says, even the FBI's crime data is suspect. There's a piece in here, hang on. Okay, in 2020, nearly 3,000 law enforcement agencies around the country opted not to send the FBI their crime data, leaving 14.8% of law enforcement agencies and the crimes committed in their respective jurisdictions unaccounted for in the National Incident-Based Reporting System. So we see now that statistics cannot be relied on, certainly in how we treat each other on an individual level. So this brings us back to the whole idea of lived experiences and listening to people, Black people, and their lived experiences. When I thought a little bit about that at first, I'm thinking, well, a lived experience is kind of individual and doesn't necessarily spread out to the whole of the group. But the preponderance of those conversations, those stories, will tell you what's happening. They use an example in this article that if there was a woman who was in a car accident, she was thrown from her car, and she survived. The car was totally destroyed because she was thrown from her car and wasn't wearing a seatbelt. So she took from that seatbelts are dangerous. So we need to be very careful about taking anecdotal information from anybody and extrapolating them to the whole. But when we listen in conversations like Gail and Anita described to the personal experiences of Black people, their histories within the country, since they were brought to our shores, what they're experiencing now, how those experiences relate to the history of slavery, then a truer picture starts to emerge. So I do want to read something that Ibram X. Kendi says, and I think this is really enlightening. He says, Americans have long been trained to see the deficiencies of people rather than policy. It's a pretty easy mistake to make. People are in our faces, policies are distant. We are particularly poor at seeing the policies lurking behind the struggles of people. So just to kind of bring that home, the common rhetoric might be, why don't Black people pull themselves up by their bootstraps?
They were allowed to have bootstraps.
You were not allowed to have any boots.
It was against the law for us to have bootstraps.
Yeah, it was against the law. Why aren't, the whole thing about education, Black people were blocked from education for the first however many years, even after slavery. And then certainly, education was segregated, lower quality, and so on. And those all came into being by policies that were voted on by probably white men at that time. And so those policies keep rippling out even today. And I think that, it's really important for us to think about, instead of looking at any group of people and making assumptions from what you see right in front of them, ask yourself, what would be that person's story? What is their story? How are they here? What hurdles were they not able to jump? Get to know some people in those situations. We tend to cluster with like people, people who have similar experiences, live in our neighborhoods, and so on. But get to know somebody way outside of your neighborhood, your educational background, your job, and see what you learn. I mean, like Anita was talking about, the three of us coming from such different backgrounds. Oh my goodness, what I have learned from them. And, I've learned so much about how much I had no exposure to any of this growing up. And I just was subjected to policies that I thought were fine, probably, didn't challenge them, didn't know to challenge them. So I think that that's really important to reach out. Let's see. Oh, there was another article in Teen Vogue, from where I do not get all my information, but it's pretty well written. It's pretty grabbing. It says, this is just so important. I don't think it can be said enough. Black Lives Matter is an affirmation in a world that has made it abundantly clear that to many, Black lives don't matter. Mm-hmm. I hope people are listening, just write that down. That's what Black Lives Matter means. That they were, they have been killed since, their time in this country for sure, and around the world, for merely existing in the bodies in which they were born. They were, I'm not sure I want to quote this one project because I don't know these people, but there was a report released by the U.S. Department of Justice in 2017 that found that all of the violent crimes between 2012 and 15, 22.7% were committed by Black people. May I contrast that to the 60% this guy said online? 22%, and 63% of those crimes were committed against other Black people.
Yeah. And if I could interject at this point,
You bet.
I think that is one of the major issues. And I understand the problem. And I'm glad all of the stuff that you said, because people need to understand the problem with statistics, right?
Mhm.
But then if you do go and look at the FBI statistics, one of the, even though they may be underreported for the most part, this is what we got, right? But one of the really, really telling things is that Black on Black crime is not that different from white on white crime, in the sense that crimes are based on, especially violent crimes, are generally based on proximity, which means they're racial. So that means Black folks might be killing Black folks, but at the same time, white folks are killing white folks, Asian folks are killing Asian folks. But when you look at all of this information about crime, the first thing that pops into people in the headlines, Black on Black, you never hear white on white crime.
Or Asian or Asian or anything.
Or Asian or whatever. So it creates this illusion
Yes.
that Black people are the only ones who commit crimes. Or if you look at something that says, oh, Black people committed 20%, or 20% of the people, whatever. But what about the 80% who didn't do that? And so it always kind of focuses on what that number was, but then, okay, 20% did this. Okay, but that means 80% didn't do that. What are the other 80%? What are they doing? Are they people like me who don't commit crimes? Then we just go do our thing, go to work, raise up our children and stuff like that. And so it just creates this illusion.
Distortion.
And a distortion, exactly, that we're the only ones that commit crime. And that's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous.
And in fact, over the last 10 years, the percentage of white people who are committing crimes against white people is going up.
Mm-hmm.
And the percentage of Black people committing crimes against Black people is going down.
That's right.
I found that fascinating. I just name a Black serial killer. Most serial killers are white.
That's right.
And we don't highlight that as part of the issue.
No, exactly.
But we're much more comfortable thinking that Black people are naturally violent. We're not comfortable. This is the rhetoric that we hear.
Right. And then you think about when we were on a long talk, and Kyle was talking about lynchings. Lynchings are presented as this thing that happened to Black people. But he pointed out, no, the thing that from a historical perspective, the real significance of Tulsa, Oklahoma is that we built it up. We built Tulsa, Oklahoma. We built Black Wall Street. And then what happened? White people came in and destroyed it. So it was a massacre perpetrated by violence of white people against Black people.
Because they were so successful.
Because of their success. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And I thought that was really interesting that Kyle was saying, we're not talking about not knowing Black history here. This is white history.
Right.
Exactly.
White people destroyed this successful business district.
And that's what they wanted.
Black people had constructed themselves and were doing well, working with each other.
Mm-hmm. And there were other communities, other communities, Rosewood, Florida, another example. And I mean, Central Park used to be Seneca Village.
Right.
We were moved out of Seneca Village so that Central Park could be developed. It wasn't through like a massacre, but still, that was a successful Black community that was wiped out in the name of Central Park, essentially. And so, again, I think the climate that we're in right now, this is the moment for white people.
Yes.
To really sit down at the table and have these conversations. Because the issue right now is really you.
Mm-hmm.
It's what you're doing. It's what you're thinking. And inadvertently, what you may be doing to uphold this system that is so damaging to the entire country.
Right. Because it's not just damaging to Black people, it's damaging to everyone.
Everybody. Exactly.
And to take ownership. That everybody has a part in it. And it really is a white issue. And it's time that we all come to that table and start looking within ourselves and communicating authentically.
Whenever I've tried to share with people the work we're doing, I might state a fact that I've come to know. And often the response is not along the lines of the conversation that Gail describes. It's, but what about? Like a Black friend of mine was called the N-word and screamed at for driving out of a parking lot the wrong way or something. And a white friend of mine said, that's happened to me too. So you're missing the story when you rebut that way. Right. So listen to understand what was really happening to the Black driver. How did that feel when she was called the N-word, which is a whole other level of intimidation and violence, really. Yes. And I just think that we want to challenge everything with our what abouts.
Right. And so for that particular what about, if I had been in that conversation, I would have asked her, so how many times in your life have you been called the N-word?
Right.
How many times in your white life have you been called the N-word?
Right.
Well, but would that person even know the violence and the denigration really associated with it? Like it doesn't.
But that's not even the point. The point is that is not a part of your experience. I don't care if you people say, well, I've been stopped by the police. Okay, great. But again, in this particular situation, the Black woman was describing being called the N-word. And the woman's like, oh, well, I've had whatever happened to me as well. Yeah. But how many times in your life have you been called the N-word?
Exactly. You experience that. Right.
So you can't, in those types of conversations, you're trying to equate your experience, my experience.
That's what I'm getting at.
Without even having the depth of, not even understanding me and my experience, but just understanding the depth of racism.
Right.
Yes.
You have a very superficial, this is like when people talk about reverse racism, like that doesn't even make sense. It doesn't even make sense whatsoever, but okay, you want to say that. So describe to me your personal experience with having you denied something solely because you're a white guy.
Right.
Name the instance, you personally, when you were denied something because of the color of your skin.
Well, what about when that Black guy got the job instead of me?
Okay, so let's look at that. So that same company, the majority of the white people, the majority of the employees are most likely white.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe you have a handful, like 3 non-white people that are working in that company. Another person comes along and that person happens to be more qualified than you. So just because this person got this position and you did not, and you're going to attribute it to, oh, well, that's reverse racism. How about he's more qualified than you? And we hired a more qualified individual. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Do you know?
Do you know? Exactly. Or are you just making this untold
You're making the assumption
that was the only reason I could have possibly gotten that job is because I'm Black? How about because I'm qualified?
Yeah.
You see?
Yeah.
How easy it is, but that's also because you're looking at racism and these racialized society from an extremely superficial, intellectual perspective, because you cannot really speak to your own history within that context.
Right.
You can't.
No, it's impossible.
It's like the woman who doesn't want to wear a seatbelt. You know, affirmative action means the Black person will get the job. Therefore, that's what always happens if a Black person is hired.
Right, exactly.
Right,
but also recognizing when you look at real affirmative action statistics, who benefits? White women.
White women, no less. Huh?
Exactly. So we are almost out of time.
My gosh.
It seems like we always are running out of time when the conversation gets really juicy, right? So again, just to kind of summarize, I think everything that we've talked about literally goes back to our 4 tenets. It takes courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Those 4 things are the ingredients that we can mix in the conversation, mix in us coming together to be able to bring about some change. Because if we don't bring about change now. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.
The views expressed on this program are those of the hosts, guests, and callers, and are not necessarily those of KKNW, its management, or other advertisers. Contests are the responsibility of the hosts of this program